We turn now to a consideration of the rise of alternative rock in the 1990s. This entire movement, alternative rock, was really sparked by the commercial success of Nirvana's Nevermind in 1991. It's kind of a breakthrough album that kind of opens the doors to alternative rock. In many ways parallel to, for example, the Beatles appearing on Ed Sullivan in February of 1964. All of a sudden there's a flood of British invasion groups. And so this is really what happens after the success of Nirvana's Nevermind from 1991. It didn't all happen at once, though. It seems like an important sort of watershed event as we look back on it, the commercial release of Nevermind. But actually, the whole thing had been building for some time. The alternative scene arises out of the indie rock scene of the 1980s that we've talked about, and the hardcore punk scene that we spent some time talking about. There were, as you'll recall, groups that did sign major label contracts, moving away from their indie labels as we got to the second half of the 1980s. And really the best representative of that is REM coming out of Athens, Georgia, with their album Document, which is their first major label recording. Goes to number 10 in 1987. They have a number 9 hit with The One I Love. And the success of REM really becomes the kind of blueprint for a lot of what's going to happen with alternative. A lot of major labels start thinking, well, we should get an indie band, and maybe we can have the same kind of success with one of our groups that REM has had. And so you begin to see groups toward the end of the 80s start to get signed by major labels. Of course, this is something of an integrity check for a lot of indie groups, because part of the pride of who they were is that they were an alternative to major label kinds of groups, the kinds of groups that were appearing on MTV and on FM radio. They were a different kind of thing. And so when they begin to sign with major labels, there's a question of whether they're sort of selling out. And we'll come back to this topic again in our next lecture when we talk about how the indie scene continues, even after a lot of these indie bands start to sign with major labels and become the alternative scene. Of course, alternative has its roots in 70s punk, as we talked about. 70s punk sort of developing into 80s hardcore and college rock during the 1980s there. The DIY or do-it-yourself attitude, the idea that these guys got away from the big money corporations and recorded their music on indie labels, got their music played in college radio. There was a whole series of venues. So this whole scene that's developing through the 80s really starts to gather some serious momentum toward the end of the 80s. Then the major labels get involved. And what happens is that what was in many ways indie in the 80s becomes alternative in the 90s, although maybe with a slightly more commercial bent. Fans can argue about that. We talked about Nirvana. They are really seen as not only the sort of the important band for launching alternative, but the most important representatives of something that came to be called the Seattle grunge sound. The group coming out of Aberdeen, Washington, originally led by Kurt Cobain, also with Dave Grohl on the drums. He will become increasingly important as the 90s unfold. Their first album was on an indie label called Sub Pop. It was called Bleach from 1989. The total recording cost of that first Nirvana album were $606.17. So you talk about DIY, doing things on a shoestring. That's what it cost to record that album. Of course, more to press the albums and distribute them and that kind of thing, but we're talking about pennies here. They probably spent $606.17 just on coffee for the crew alone on a Michael Jackson lunch break or something, probably even more. So that we're talking about very small numbers here. The big album, of course, as I mentioned before, their second album, Nevermind, #1 in this country, #7 in the UK in 1991, and the sort of emblematic song and video that went with that was Smells Like Teen Spirit, although lots of great tunes on that album. They followed up with In Utero in 1993, and then Unplugged in New York, 1994, a #1 album. Unfortunately, Kurt Cobain, and really quite famously, committing suicide in 1994, and that kind of being the end of Nirvana. They weren't the only Seattle band. Once the door was opened, we began to see a whole series of Seattle bands come into the business. Pearl Jam, led by vocalist Eddie Vedder, 1992. Their album 10 went to #2 in the pop charts, #18 in the UK charts. In many ways, fans can argue about this, but maybe Nirvana was more the pop band, more of a pop band of the two, although not taking anything away from the rough edge sound of a lot of what Nirvana did. There was sort of maybe a kind of a pop sensibility to a lot of Kurt Cobain's songwriting, which, even though he imaged himself as a kind of, amateur musician or all that kind of thing, was a very, very skilled songwriter, knew exactly how to put an arrangement together to make it work. Again, Smells Like Teen Spirit is a real masterpiece from that point of view. Maybe Pearl Jam was a little bit more metal influenced. A lot of these groups, the Seattle groups, had come out of not only the hardcore punk scene, but also the metal scene. And so you can see maybe more of that in Pearl Jam's music. They also became important representatives of the alt-rock lifestyle and the anti-commercial aesthetic, fighting with the company Ticketmaster, because Ticketmaster started to offer tickets for Pearl Jam concerts that were more than $20. And they said, well, look, this is not good because some of our fans won't be able to pay this much for a ticket. So they were seen as heroes from this point of view, of fighting not only a big sort of corporate giant Ticketmaster, but also fighting on behalf of their fans to sort of keep it real and to keep the prices down so that they didn't end up, with these expensive, exorbitant concert tickets. Other Seattle bands, Soundgarden, led by vocalist Chris Cornell and guitarist Kim Thayil. Their super unknown album #1 in this country, #4 in the UK in 1994. They were actually the first of these Seattle groups to sign with a major label. They signed with A&M Records in 1988, although they didn't really have their first big success until after Nirvana opened the door with Nevermind. And we should also mention Alice in Chains, led by vocalist Lane Staley, whose second album, Dirt, a #6 album in 1992. Along the West Coast, there were other interesting things going on that weren't, strictly speaking, part of the grunge scene, but when the alternative door opened, a lot of these groups started to have some pretty good success. In California, in San Francisco, we've got Faith No More, led by Mike Patton on vocals. Their album, The Real Thing, had actually gone to #11 in 1989 on the strength of the hit Epic, which was a #9 hit. But it was really the album Angel Dust that really became part of the alternative scene for them, another 10 album in 1992. We can also talk about the Red Hot Chili Peppers out of Hollywood, California, featuring Flea on the bass, a fantastic bassist in that group. Their 1991 album, Blood, Sugar, Sex, Magic, was produced by Rick Rubin, who we've talked about before. Rick Rubin, of course, the important producer for Def Jam, had produced Run DMC, a number of those groups, and of course was behind the whole idea of getting Aerosmith together with Run DMC to do Walk This Way. So he's producing the Red Hot Chili Peppers. They have a #3 album with Blood, Sugar, Sex, Magic, #5 in the UK in 1991. The big song off there, Under the Bridge, and of course the song Give It Away, the video for Give It Away, extremely innovative by MTV standards for the day, and was in sort of constant rotation. Check it out on the internet. It's a fantastic video. Even if it turns out you don't like the song very much, some of the visual effects are really stunning for their day. Of these Southern California groups, or California groups that is to say, probably Stone Temple Pilots are the only one that could be thought of as a kind of a grunge band coming out of San Diego, California. 1992, their album Core goes to #3 on the pop charts, #27 in the UK charts. Other alternative bands we should talk about that rise to fame in the period after 1991, heading towards the end of the decade. Smashing Pumpkins, coming out of Chicago, led by Billy Corgan. Here's a group that kind of tried to deny their affiliation with the punk scene and really brought in a lot of other kinds of influences that maybe some of the other groups didn't, including a little bit of sort of progressive rock kind of influence, a lot of Mellotron and stuff like that going on some of those tracks. The first big album, Siamese Dream from 1993, produced by Butch Vig, who had also produced the Nirvana Nevermind album. And then Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness from 1995, #1 album for them here, #4 in the UK, which is often seen as the sort of the big Smashing Pumpkins album. If you're going to have one, that might be the one to have. Other alternative groups we might talk about: Live, coming out of York, Pennsylvania, their album from 1994, Throwing Copper. Creed, coming out of Tallahassee, Florida, their song With Arms Open Wide from #1 from 2000. Both of those groups, Live and Creed, have a certain sort of Christian a bent to what they do, so that makes them sort of distinctive from that point of view. We might also talk about Lifehouse from Los Angeles, California, and their track Hanging by the Moment, which is maybe their most well-known tune, a #2 hit from 2001. After Nirvana broke up, Dave Grohl formed a group really around himself called Foo Fighters. And we can also talk about Rivers Cuomo and his Los Angeles-based band Weezer. This sort of a comic or comedic self-conscious presentation by both of those groups, Foo Fighters and Weezer, at least in the videos that go with it. For Weezer, check out Buddy Holly, a 1995 hit for them off their debut LP. Other groups from the alternative scene were more interested in or developed a more sort of pop-oriented sound. Green Day out of Berkeley, California, led by Billy Joe Armstrong. Very kind of punk-looking, punk-acting, but when it really comes down to the songwriting, really finely crafted songs from Billy Joe Armstrong. They did 1 LP and 2 EPs for an independent label called Lookout, and then the big album comes in 1994, or the first big breakthrough album on Reprise Records. It's called Dookie, goes to #2 in the pop charts, #13 in the UK, and the song When I Come Around, a #2 hit, it goes into constant rotation on radio and on MTV. It's interesting that their 2004 album, American Idiot, was a rock opera that was subsequently turned into a Broadway musical. Other groups we can talk about with regard to the pop-punk kind of thing, The Offspring out of Orange County, California, and Blink-182 coming out of San Diego. It's also maybe worth mentioning with regard to this kind of approach, a kind of a ska revival that starts to happen in the mid-1990s, which kind of combines reggae music going all the way back to Bob Marley and I Shot the Sheriff and some of the things we talked about in part 1, and sort of combines that with punk, at least rhythmically speaking. And so important groups in that movement are Sublime from Long Beach, California, and the Mighty, Mighty Boss Tones from Cambridge, Massachusetts. But maybe the most commercially successful of those ska revival groups comes from Anaheim, California, led by Gwen Stefani. No Doubt really hits the charts with their album Tragic Kingdom from 1995, #1 here, #3 in the UK. The songs Just a Girl and Don't Speak become pretty big hits for them. So that's a bit of a survey of what was happening with alternative in the 1990s, launched really by the success of Nirvana. Most of these groups appearing on major labels and having their success fueled by the kind of resources that come from major labels, big recording studios, promotional budgets, MTV videos, this kind of thing. So throughout the 90s, we get to the point by the mid-90s where Billy Joe Armstrong from Green Day is saying they call it alternative, but alternative to what? How can you get any more mainstream? In fact, in many ways, indie rock, which was so underground in the 80s, has now hit the big time in the 90s. It's alternative, but then it becomes, ironically, one of the sort of mainstream kinds of styles. So the question we want to ask ourselves is, after indie goes alternative and becomes mainstream, what happens to indie? That's what we'll talk about in the next video.